So during this Lent, we are journeying through the worship series called God on the Move. And the point of having this whole season of Lent is to set aside these 40 days, intentional 40 days, to really reflect on our spiritual journey. That's the whole point. And it's about this opportunity to look back at ourselves. And we can ask ourselves a question: do I need to turn? Do I need to return? Or do I need to overturn during this time? Last week we talked about moving in general, and that it has two sides to it. Remember I asked you if you like moving or not? Right, and there's that part which we drag ourselves with, right? Having to pack and having to change everything the way you do. Not a favorable aspect of moving for a lot of people. And on the other side, there's that part that brings you some kind of an excitement, because moving means new opportunities and new things in life in general. Ultimately, the questions for this whole season of Lent is, as our eyes are on the cross, we ask ourselves, are we on the move, or are we standing still where we are, or are we falling behind? And while keeping that double-sidedness of whole moving imagery, we were reminded how Jesus was always moving from place to place. Last week, we started off with the scene where Jesus moved to the wilderness right after being blessed at his baptism. He moved into the wilderness where he was tempted by the devil. And today, on this second Sunday of Lent, we are continuing to move with God as Jesus went through the towns and villages, making his way towards Jerusalem. Without meaning to sound so depressing, this past week was one of those weeks that we wondered, at least I wondered, what's wrong with this world? Is there hope? Is it possible to see ourselves moving past beyond this mess that we're experiencing? We heard the news about the bribery in college admissions by the top privileged families in our society. We heard about the massacre in New Zealand, which killed at least 49 people. Once again, we saw the ugly face of hatred and violence. And of course, we continue to wonder about what's going to happen with our denomination as new allegation has been surfacing. And just within our community, we see and hear about the economic injustice. I hear so many of our sisters and brothers suffering daily in such system where it keeps the poor in poverty. And that influences into every aspect of their lives. I was asking myself this question: what's sanctuary? What is sanctuary? Can we call today's houses of worship a true sanctuary? Is it a place where we can feel the ultimate safety in the presence of God? Can we call this place a sanctuary? Is that true to everyone? Regardless of one's ethnicity, one's economic status, one's basic needs, one's gender identity, one's political view, one's citizenship, one's housing situation, one's records in the past, and even regardless of their faith tradition. Are we truly a sanctuary? But let's think about this. Are we moving on? Or the better question might be, can we move on? The ugly face of survival and tribalism wasn't much different during Jesus' days. There are a few characters in today's story we just heard, and we see the dynamic between them. We start off by some Pharisees warning Jesus about Herod. And one thing to remember, one thing to know is that during this time there was a tension between the Herodians and the Pharisees. There are two different groups. It is important to understand the distinction between these two. You see, the name Herod that we hear about in this story, today's story, is Herod Antipas, who is actually the son of the Herod the Great, who was the one we are more familiar with from our Christmas stories, right? So it's his son we're talking about today. And the situation was a little different. While the father, Herod, was more established in the political system, after his death, the son, the Herod we're talking about today, who succeeded the power, did not have the same respect, same level of political influence as his father did. In fact, the Romans intentionally did not allow him to use king's title. So he was never a king. So sometimes we remember calling Herod the King Herod, but he was never called that. The son never was called that. They controlled him from having too much of a power. So there were division among Jews. There were those Jews who supported Herod, who we are calling them Herodians. And then obviously some Jews were not a strong supporter of the son Herod. And the Pharisees were not a fan of Herod. So there was this tension between the Pharisees and the Herodians. Understanding this dynamic helps us understand the tone of the Pharisees warning Jesus about Herod trying to kill him. Now, in response to this, Jesus does few things in his response. First, he self-differentiates himself by making it clear to them that he's not going to fall into this political trap or to get sucked into this political power game they're playing between the Pharisees and Herodians. While they were fighting, Jesus' focus was on something so much bigger. So Herod was not a threat before God's will, before God's vision. Herod's will is in no competition to what God is doing through Jesus. The foxes are not in control as much as they think they are. This past week, I brought back out a book that I read a year ago called Sapiens. I don't know if you heard that, by Yuval Noah Harari. And I think I was hoping to zoom out from all the little details of today's news that I was hearing and spend some time to view the bigger picture of the history of humanity. And remind myself, by doing that, all the things that seem like dead-end streets or the thickest darkness that we're going through right now, they are all part of God's grand history making with his creation. And one of the things I was looking to find the answer for was, when did we start fighting? Now that's a different question than when I see Noah and Zoe screaming all morning this morning while I was trying to get the last 5 minutes of my sleep. Yeah, I don't know, maybe we're in tune to it nowadays. But historically, when did we start fighting? And while there are limitations in talking about prehistoric records, many scholars argue that a concept of war and violence towards another human tribe was introduced during the agricultural revolution. What this means is that for 2.5 million years, 2.5 million years, Homo sapiens lived by hunting and gathering wild plants. This time, prior to the agricultural revolution, is called the cognitive revolution. So until after 2.5 million years of human beings being human, being a hunter-gatherer, they learned how to domesticate certain types of animals and plants so that they can be settled in one place. And that only started 10,000 years ago. Homo sapiens began to settle only 10,000 years ago. So this is another lens that we can understand, or we can read the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, the cognitive revolution of knowing, and also Cain and Abel, hunter-gatherer, agricultural. So that's another lens that we can use to read our Bibles. And during that agricultural revolution, what was introduced during this time was that human beings started to have something to lose. They started to have something to lose. Until then, they just eat whatever they found on the floor, on the ground, sleep under any cave they found on the way. Of course, the lifespan got much longer, right? And when they consumed one area, the resources from one area, they looked over to their neighboring tribes and began tribal wars to survive. That's when we started fighting. When we created the concept of my possession. When we created the concept of my well-being, my will, my tribe, my color, my class. But then, when we continued on that road of becoming narrower and narrower in our worldview, Jesus comes to us. Jesus comes to us to tell us about God's will and God's desire. You probably heard of the name Bishop Michael Curry, who officiated the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. He said about this scripture reading like this: for Jesus, God's passionate dream, the compassionate desire, and bold determination is to gather God's human children closer and closer in God's embrace and love. That mission and commitment is at the center of all of Jesus' work. Like a mother hen, God seeks to draw, embrace, include, and welcome God's children into the family of humanity that God has intended from the dawn of Eden itself. So God is on the move with God's passionate dream to gather God's human children closer and closer in God's embrace and love. The question for us today, I guess, and during this Lent is, what's our choice? What is our choice? Can we move on with God? Can we make that choice to see beyond our own wills, our own desires to be static and in maintaining our comfortable environment around us, our own trap that we put ourselves into simply survive another day. The question is, can we see what God is seeing? Can we see that? One commentary I read this week said this: what the role of the cross, what the cross does to us is it tells us that survival is overrated. What the cross tells us is that survival is overrated. Let that sink in a little bit. Something to think about as we reflect upon our attitude each morning, or our attitude as we look into future. But there is a very clear good news that is proclaimed from today's reading. And that is that Jesus is super determined. That's a very good news. Jesus is super determined. Jesus is on an unstoppable course toward Jerusalem. And the greater thing about this is that Jesus is on this unstoppable course toward us, toward our hearts. And nothing can stop him. Not even by the obstacles that we put before him. It's Lent. It's Lent. The course is set before us, beginning from Ash Wednesday to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and to the cross on the Good Friday, and to the tomb. The course is set before us. And as we continue to encourage ourselves to move beyond the hardships in our lives, I pray for each of you that your Lenten journey is the one that you clearly remember. That kind of determined love of Christ for you. And again, absolutely nothing can stop him from loving us. Amen.